welcome to the latest episode of the SCOTBALL podcast. And today, ahead of the friendly international between Scotland and Japan, I am speaking to a journalist and author, Tiago Bontempo. Firstly, Tiago, thanks a lot for taking the time to chat with me today. If you could just tell the listeners a bit about yourself, your work as a journalist, and your passion for Japanese football, that would be great.
Well, I have always loved football since I discovered it for the first time in 1994 World Cup, and I was kind of blessed that my first experience was watching my country win the World Cup. Brazil won it in 1994, and then World Cups are always magic to me, and it was after the 2010 World Cup that I decided that I wanted to work with sports journalism. And then the following year, I started university studying journalism. At first, I thought I would work covering Brazilian or European football because in Brazil I support Botafogo, a club that was in the Club World Cup last year. And in Europe, I became an Arsenal fan and used to follow the English Premier League a lot. However, in the end of 2010, I started researching about Japanese football just out of curiosity because I was studying the Japanese language. And then I just mixed together the two things that I like, Japan and football. When I realized I was following Japanese football much more than Brazilian or European football, it became a passion, and the more I knew about Japanese football, the more I fell in love with it. Also, I think it's worth noting that besides Brazil and Japan being located at exactly opposite places of the globe, and the culture of both countries are also totally the opposite in many aspects, there is a close connection between Brazil and Japan because in Brazil we have the largest Japanese community in the world outside of Japan. There are about 2 million people in Brazil with Japanese ancestry, and some parts of the Japanese culture, like video games, animes, food, are very popular in Brazil. So I used to practice judo as a child, and maybe it influenced somehow that I decided to study the Japanese language years later.
That's fascinating, Tiago. And could you tell us a bit about your book, Samurai Azue? My
Well,
pronunciation there was probably very bad, but let's hear about your book.
Well, when I started researching about Japanese football, I still couldn't read Japanese at all. So I looked for websites and books in English to learn more. I found some books in English, but none in Portuguese. This was in 2010, 2011. At the time, I thought, since there's no book about Japanese football in Portuguese, maybe I can write one someday. It took a long time, but in 2022, this dream finally came true. The purpose of the book is to make a kind of timeline explaining how football was introduced and developed in Japan, how the J League was created, how they made football a popular sport in Japan, how the national team evolved until recent years, how big was the influence of Brazilians and other foreigners, while trying to explain the cultural aspect of how Japanese view sports in their lives. But basically, the book tries to explain how Japan became good at football. Unfortunately, it is only available in Portuguese, but I have already started to translate some chapters to English, and hopefully, if I find a publisher interested in publishing the book in English, it would be awesome.
Amazing. Congratulations for publishing the book. I looked into it and it looks brilliant. I'll put in a link to it as well on the podcast description. And yeah, before today, you told me that there are some linkages between Japan and Scotland with regards to football and the way that Japanese football progressed in its infancy. What could you tell us about these linkages between Japan and Scotland?
Well, today we know that Japan plays a brand of football that is focused on technique and short passes that was greatly influenced by Brazil. But maybe many people don't know that the first foreign influence on Japanese football actually came from Scotland. That was I was telling you beforehand. It happened about 100 years ago We all know that the English was the ones who introduced football to Japan, but the first time that Japan played decent football was because of Scottish influence. It happened in the 1920s. At that time, exchange students from Burma called Chodin taught basic soccer techniques to the players at Waseda University in Tokyo. Until then, the only way of playing football the Japanese knew was to imitate the kick and rush the English used to play. However, this Burmese guy, Chodin, he taught the short passing style that he learned from the Scottish people that lived in his country. He thought that it would fit better the Japanese. So yeah, we can say that the roots of the current Japanese playing style actually came from Scotland because of what happened 100 years ago.
This is fascinating because I was aware that the oldest international match ever was Scotland v England. So at the origins of football, Scotland were at the forefront. And there was a lot of immigration between Scotland and South America to like Argentina and Uruguay. And I was aware before that the Scots like to play a short passing style of play. So it's interesting to learn that the Japanese were also influenced. But Tiago, I'm interested in the current day. With regards to the whole of Japanese society, what is the status of football in terms of the most popular sports? How big is it? How popular is football? And how has that evolved in recent times?
Well, the J League, the Japanese Professional Football League, was created in 1993. Before that, we can say that any ordinary people in Japan would not even know the rules of football. However, the J League was a huge success in making football popular, with a lot of money invested and many star players from abroad. For example, in the first season, the most famous and influential ones were Zico from Brazil and Gary Lineker from England. Since then, football became the number 2 sport in Japan, just behind baseball in popularity. And many Japanese told me that among football children, today football is already more popular than baseball. And there are many schools in Japan where there are more kids playing football than baseball. The J League was created with the intent of making the national team strong. First, they wanted to go to the World Cup. They managed to go for the first time in 98, and since then never missed one. Now they want to actually win the World Cup. There is a long-term plan that is to win the World Cup until 2050. But the J League was also created, in the words of the president, to create a social revolution, to create the culture of football supporters. And I think Japan managed to create a unique supporter culture, blending the football culture of Europe and South America to create their own way of watching and supporting football.
This is super interesting, and I don't know whether you would agree, but in the last 10, 15 years, I have noticed a big improvement in the Japanese football, especially the national team. In the World Cups, you've played some very good football, notably topping the group alongside Spain and Germany, two of the biggest teams in Europe in 2022. Would you say it's fair to assess that in the last 10, 15 years that Japanese footballing standards have really risen?
Yes, surely. Every time that Japan goes out of a World Cup happens to be a disappointment because there's always that feeling that they could have gone further. For example, in 2002, in the round of 16 against Turkey, the team played with no sense of urgency as the players were just feeling relieved for getting out of the group stage, which was the goal at the time. In 2010, they lost on penalties to Paraguay, but especially in the last 2 World Cups, it was heartbreaking to the fans in the end. In 2018, Japan played better than Belgium for most of the time. In 2022, Japan was not inferior to Croatia at all and could have won in the 90 minutes had they pushed a bit more, since the Croatian players were much more tired. You can say that in each decade Japan has a better team than the previous one. Japan focused on his technical brand of football because they were always trying to emulate the Brazilian players. You can say that Brazil and Japan in football have a kind of teacher-student relationship, because since before the professional era, most of the foreign players in Japan were Brazilians. In Japan, everyone agrees that the current national team is the strongest ever. You may not have such big names there as there were Nakata and Nakamura in the 2000s, or Honda and Kagawa in the past decade, but this generation, they have more quality and quantity overall. For example, goalkeepers and center backs who used to be a weak point of Japan are not considered weak points anymore. There are plenty of talent in midfield, and the last missing piece would be the center forward. This will be the first World Cup that Japan will play not with the objective of just reaching quarterfinals and being satisfied with that. Now the players, the manager, everyone is saying they are aiming for the title. About, let's say, about 10 years ago, that kind of statement would sound crazy, but now the Japanese think it's not impossible anymore. The JFA has a long-term plan of winning the World Cup until 2050, as I had said. Maybe it's a bit too early to realistically win it now, but I think that if Japan wants to actually win it someday, they indeed should start to think about it now. So I believe that Japan is going to win the World Cup someday. I just hope to still be alive to see that.
Yeah, and honestly, as I say, recently, last couple of World Cups, I've been very impressed by Japan. I think the football that Japan plays is one of the most impressive styles of play I've seen in recent World Cups. Very technical, very short, sharp passing, also very athletic, great stamina. So I'm interested to see how the culture of football continues to evolve and progress in Japan. But talking about the current team, you said there that there's been statements that this team are going to target the title. I looked at the group that Japan is involved in. You had a 100% record in qualifying, won every single match, and now you're in the group with Netherlands, Tunisia, and a winner of the UEFA playoffs. How do you assess this group, and how do you assess the expectations in the country of Japan for the World Cup overall?
Well, you can say that in this World Cup, Japan goes with the highest expectation ever. And this is a kind of tricky thing because in the previous World Cups, Japan performed well when the expectations were not that high. And in the World Cups with the highest expectation so far, which was the 2006 and the 2014 ones, were the World Cups where Japan performed the worst. So there is this kind of thing that when Japan has a lot of pressure for them to perform, they don't used to play their best. And when you don't expect Japan to play their best, it is when they play like 100%. So saw that in the last World Cup was a perfect example of that, because most were not expecting them to get through that group. Most were not expecting they would manage to win against Germany and against Spain, and they actually won these matches. And most were expecting them to beat Costa Rica and Croatia, and they could not do that. So I think this is a perfect example of how the Japanese performed.
And what can you tell us about your manager, Moriyasu? He became the manager of Japan in 2018. What is he like as a person, and what is his tactics like?
Well, Moriyasu, he is known for being a really kind guy. No one has any bad word about him. They say he is just actually he is even criticized for being, how would you say, too nice. But at he's now in his second term with the national team, and he's going to his second World Cup in Japan. And the first cycle until the 2022 World Cup, it was really, how would you say, like a roller coaster, because in the qualifying that were some really tough moments when he almost lost his job. Japan was really risking not qualifying for the previous World Cup. But I think that Moriyasu evolved a lot during these 8 years at the helm, and I think that most Japanese supporters now trust what Moriyasu is doing, and I think also the results speak for themselves. And he, you can say that Moriyasu was, for a long time, Japan used to think that a foreign manager was better. So before Moriyasu, we had Zaccheroni, an Italian manager. There was also Halilhodžić, Bosnian manager. There was Ivica Osim, another Bosnian manager. There was Zico, Brazilian manager. There was Philippe Troussier, a French manager. So a lot of foreigners. When Moriyasu finally were given his chance, it was the moment where the JFA thought, well, now we want to go with a Japanese manager. Maybe Moriyasu is the guy. Maybe he is finally ready. Because when Japan hires a foreign manager, there is always the problem that he may take some time to adapt to the culture, how things work, to how to deal with the players, to not just to know the J League and the players, but to know the way to deal with the players in daily life. For example, I have read recently the biography of Arsene Wenger and how he changed after managing in Japan. The way he approached the player, the way he, for example, when he was angry at the players, how he would show his anger to the players, it changed after he went to Japan, because the way he would do in France would just not work in Japan. And then he said he learned how to have more peace of mind, how to meditate more, how to be a more relaxed person. And he said he's greatly improved his methods of training. And also thinking on the future, for example, after Moriyasu retires from the national team, who could be the next one. Probably they are still going to another Japanese manager. I think the direction they are going is to that. But if there is a foreigner that knows very well the Japanese culture, he knows very well the Japanese football, there is a possibility they would give him a chance. And if this is going to happen, I think that Ange Postecoglou would be probably the most likely candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I was going to ask you about Ange Postecoglou, because obviously there's a natural link between Japanese football and Scottish football in recent years, because Ange Postecoglou was the manager of Celtic and he signed a lot of Japanese players to the team. What can you tell us about the status of Postecoglou in Japan? What do people think of him and his time in the J League?
Well, Postecoglou, he became a legend in Japan when he won the J League title with Yokohama F. Marinos in 2019. His status in Japan raised even more after he went to Celtic and then to Tottenham. I even think that the JFA is considering Postecoglou for the national team job as a potential successor of Moriyasu. Also, Postecoglou, he left a legacy in Japan that made a lot of teams try to emulate his style of footballs. And many guys who worked as assistant coaches of Postecoglou were given opportunities to manage teams in Japan after Ange left to Scotland. There were Kevin Muscat, Peter Klamovski. Now there is Arthur Papas.
This is interesting. So he is a potential future Japan manager, you think? And yeah, just on the Japanese players that have played for Celtic, there's been a lot that have been signed in recent years, but probably the standout names are Daisen Maeda, Kyogo Furuhashi, and Reo Hatate. I've always been interested because Kyogo did very well at Celtic, so has Hatate, but Maeda's been the main one that's had the chance to play in the national team more regularly. Why do you think that is, and why do you think Kyogo and Hatate have not had as many opportunities to play for the national team?
Well, I think that Maeda has been a regular for the national team because of his unique characteristics, because there is not any other player that can run tirelessly as Maeda does. Pressing without the ball is a crucial part of Moriyasu's tactics, especially when playing against stronger teams. in matches where Japan will not have most of the ball possession. Also, Maeda can play many positions in Japan's systems, such as center forward, second striker, offensive midfielder in both left and right wings. So Maeda is a very useful squad player. However, we can't say that he has a guaranteed spot among the 26 players in the World Cup roster since he's not a starter. About Kyogo, I think it's a complex case. I think there are many people in Scotland that can't understand why he's not in the national team, even after everything he did at Celtic. Even me at the beginning, I failed to understand the reasons for many times where he was not selected, but I think that the Kyogo that we used to see at Celtic never turned it out for the national team. Kyogo had plenty of chances but didn't take advantage of them while playing for Japan. His play style, I would say, simply did not fit with the national team. As most of the times he played, for example, he barely touched the ball. His numbers are really not good. Kyogo has, I have looked at the numbers. Kyogo has 23 caps for the national team and only 5 goals. Or of these five, four were against really weak opponents that Japan won easily with high scores, such as Tajikistan, Mongolia, El Salvador. The only match against decent opposition where Kyogo performed well and scored was against Tunisia. Now there are many other players at his position in the national team, and recently some young strikers emerged, such as Keisuke Goto, who is playing in Sint-Truiden in Belgium, and Kento Shiogai, who is playing for Wolfsburg in Germany, and he was called for the first time now. So I think it's already game over for Kyogo at the national team, unfortunately. About Hatate, Hatate is a player that I always liked, and for a long time I wanted him to have more chances in the national team, but he also didn't make a good use of the opportunities he had. But unlike Kyogo, Hatate didn't have many opportunities to play for the national team. I think that his weakness of losing the ball in midfield really worked against him, and recently he fell even further in the pecking order of Moriyasu. So, according to my own notice, I would say that there are 9 players ahead of Hatate at his position for Japan. And I'm not joking. Defensive midfield is currently the position where Japan has the most number of options in the pool. For example, Wataru Endo and Hidemasa Morita has been the starters, but neither of them was called this time. But we have Kaishu Sano and Ao Tanaka who can play at the same level. And there is also Daichi Kamada and 2 young players, Joel Chima Fujita and Kodai Sano, who are very similar to Hatate, but more talented, and they are playing on a higher level in Europe than Hatate. There's Fujita playing in Germany for St. Pauli, and Kodai Sano is one of the most highly rated young prospects in the Netherlands, and Daichi Kamada in Crystal Palace in the Premier League. I really like Hatate, and I love to see him play, but unfortunately I think that it's almost impossible for him to go to the World Cup as well.
This is amazing insight. Yeah, I was aware that Japan have got a lot of quality in central midfield, so it's difficult for Hatate to break in. Just speaking about the Japanese players there, in your opinion, Tiago, who are the cornerstones of the team, the most important players that you will rely on in the World Cup?
Now, I think that the main difference from this current Japan team to the previous generations is there is not a player that a player that is much different than the others, in the sense that if this guy is not playing, the quality of the team will drop. For example, we can say that Kubo and Mitoma are currently the best Japanese players. Kubo is injured, he's not going to play this time, and Mitoma, he is just recovering from injury, so he will probably have limited time. But we have one thing that Moriyasu is focusing on while building and developing this team, is that he says that he he doesn't want just 11 players. He wants 22 players. He wants the players who are on the bench to be almost on the same level as the starters. And I think that this is the main characteristic of this current Japanese team. So this is something that Moriyasu has been developing on his team, but if you have to pick names, well, Kubo and Mitoma are the best players and the most talented players. And on defense, there is Tomiyasu, and the guy who is playing for Ajax. He has played for Arsenal before. That I think that is one level above the other defenders.
Yeah, this is interesting. As you say, Japan have got a very well balanced squad, but there are individuals who play for top clubs. As you mentioned, Mitoma at Brighton in the Premier League, Kubo, Real Sociedad, and Tomiyasu, who played for Arsenal, now Ajax, Endo, who's at Liverpool. If you were to suggest any players that are less well known in Europe, maybe younger players that you think are on the cusp of breaking into a big team in Europe, or you think have got high potential that Scottish listeners might not be aware of, who would you say, Tiago?
Well, I think it would be Sato, Yunosuke Sato. He is one of the youngest players of the Japanese national team. He was called this time. He's still playing the J League for FC Tokyo. Last year, he was the best young player in the league. And I think he has the potential to be one of the leaders of the next generation. So I think he is, of course, it's not guaranteed that he's going to the World Cup. By the way, there is the possibility that to get him called in the final 26, Maeda has a chance to be the one dropped. So I think the Celtic fans will not be much happy with that. But I think he's a player with much potential to play in the bigger leagues in Europe. So Ryunosuke Sato, I think, is the player to look for in this Japanese national team.
Nice, a name to remember and to look out for in the future then. And ahead of the match this Saturday between Scotland and Japan, I'm interested, Tiago, your thoughts and feelings towards Scotland as a football nation, any of the players of Scotland that you admire. When I say Scotland and the national team, what thoughts come to your mind?
Well, first of all, the passion of the supporters in Scotland. I think that maybe even in Brazil we don't have a bigger rivalry than Celtic and Rangers. Some may be comparable perhaps, but not bigger, I think. I have followed a lot of Celtic matches, especially when Postecoglou were there, when Kyogo were there, and the atmosphere of the supporters of the stadium is something that looks really, really, really great. Talking about Scotland, I also remember that one of the most maybe influential presence of Scottish guys in Japan, it was not a player, not a manager, but a referee. In the 19s, there was a referee called Leslie Mottram, a Scottish guy that was called to the J League to be like a model to the Japanese referees. They were pretty amateur in that time.
And yeah, I'm just interested that Scotland and Japan have played 3 times before. There have been 2 draws and 1 Japan victory. How do you assess the levels between the 2 teams at the moment? What kind of match do you anticipate?
Well, first of all, I think that Japan is going to approach this match firstly thinking let's not have an injury. So I don't expect them to play at the same intensity as a competitive match. Maybe Scotland will do the same. Therefore, I don't think it will be a proper match to compare the levels of the teams. So I don't expect Japan to play with their best members either. First, because Japan have many players that are currently injured, such as Itakura, Kubo, Machida, Minamino. All of them would be likely starters with the best members, and also some important of international windows with 2 friendlies. Moriyasu has always changed a lot of the starters from one match to another. So I expect Japan to play with an experimental alternative lineup against Scotland and with the best members available against England. As you said, played 3 times against Scotland, and all of them were close matches, all of them friendlies, and all of them in Japan. 2-0 in 1995, 0-0 in 2006, and 2-0 to Japan in 2009, with both goals coming in the final minutes. So all of the matches until now were close ones. So I expect also a closed match this time as well because it's an away game from Japan, and if there is something that Japan really needs to improve, it's when playing in away matches.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think it will be a close match, but I'm interested to see how the two teams, the different styles of play collide. I think Japan are a better passing team than Scotland, but Scotland are very physical and organised. So yeah, I think it'll be an interesting match, and I'm excited to see how Japan look at Hampden. And just finally, Tiago, you've been very generous with your time, but if I was to ask you for your favourite 11 of Japanese players in your time following Japanese football, who would you pick?
Well, is really difficult.
Yeah.
Uh, I am not going to include most of the current players because my assessment of them might change, especially after this upcoming World Cup. But I think that my current 11 would be with Kawashima as the goalkeeper. Probably there are many who would rather pick Kawaguchi as he had more brilliant moments for Japan, but overall I think that Kawashima was a better keeper and he played on a higher level during his career. Side backs would be Nagatomo on the left. I think this is pretty much an obvious choice. Nagatomo has been called to the national team even today. He has been called as he is 39 years old. He's not in the squad now because he picked a minor injury, but it's very likely that he will go for his fifth World Cup this summer. At right side back, it's hard to pick one between Atsuto Uchida and Hiroki Sakai, but I think I'm going with Uchida. He could have been greater if it wasn't for the injuries he suffered. Center back would be Maya Yoshida and Tomiyasu. Tomiyasu, the only player from the current generation that I'm picking because he's by far the best center back Japan has ever had. And I am just praying that he doesn't get any other serious injury. Defensive midfielders would be Makoto Hasebe and Yasuhito Endo. They not the current Endo. They played together in the 2010 and 2014 World Cups. Maybe in the future I might change my opinion here since the current Endo, Wataru Endo, he has been playing at least in the same level as Hasebe during his career, and there are many great players at this position in Japan today. Three offensive midfielders: Keisuke Honda, Hidetoshi Nakata, and Shunsuke Nakamura. I think these three guys are the biggest legends ever of Japanese football. Maybe Takekubo or Mitoma could take their position in the future, but not yet. And the center forward would be Kamamoto, a guy who played in the 60s and 70s and is still the top scorer ever for Japan national team. So I'm not picking Kazu, I'm not picking Kagawa. They would be on the bench in my all-time 11.
It's an amazing team, and I'm sure you're aware of how big a star and idol Nakamura is in Scotland too for his time at Celtic. What is his status like in Japan? How loved is he and admired is Nakamura in Japan?
Well, Nakamura, I think there are many people in Japan that still thinks he's Japan best player ever today. If you ask any Yokohama F. Marinos supporter, he will most likely mention Nakamura as his favorite player. I think that even today there are many people who still can't understand why Nakamura wasn't called for the 2002 World Cup. And it's if you think it's a really sad thing that he wasn't lucky at the World Cups because in 2002 the coach didn't call him. In 2006 it was when he was supposedly in his best form. He picked an injury. I think he got a cold just before the first match and he couldn't perform very well. And in 2010 he was already past his prime, so he was just a substitute. So it's really a pity that we couldn't see Nakamura do what he can do at any World Cup, but he is definitely one of the most loved players ever in Japan.
Yeah, I loved watching him in Scotland too. And Tiago, from this team that you've selected, who would be your all-time favourite, the number one, to enter the podcast Hall of Fame? Who would you say?
Now, this is also very difficult to pick because usually there is not a player that I like much more than the others, but if I have to choose one, it's Keisuke Honda. Mostly for sentimental reasons, Honda became the star of the team, and he was the most important player for Japan in almost a decade. You can say that he was the best player because technically Nakata and Nakamura were better than him, but his mentality and leadership on the pitch were not below anyone else, and he was the best performing Japanese player in World Cups. Honda played in 3 World Cups and he scored goals and he had assists in every one of them. And he even played for my club in Brazil for Botafogo.
Amazing, yeah. I remember the 2010 World Cup. Honda, amazing player. He was one of the only players to have control over this Jabulani ball. A lot of players were struggling with it, but Honda, what an amazing player. So yeah, Tiago, thanks a lot for your time today. I really appreciate it. Let me know when your book is available in English, and yeah, I'll stay in touch after this weekend's match, Scotland v Japan. But yeah, thanks again for your time today.
Yeah, thank you.